They can
Hello,
see us, but we can't
everyone.
see them.
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Melissa Hosick, and I'm the adult programming librarian at the East Brunswick Public. We are excited to have Michael C. Gabriele back to talk about his newest book. A lifelong Garden State resident, Gabriele is a 1975 graduate of Montclair State University and has worked as a journalist, freelance writer, and author for more than 40 years. He's a member of the Board of Trustees for the New Jersey Folk Festival at Rutgers University, which he spoke about a few months ago here, a member of the Executive Board for Allied Artists of America, New York, the Nutley Historical Society, and more. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melissa. It's always a pleasure to be here. Melissa and the library have been very kind and very generous to me over the years. They've supported a lot of the books that I've had published. So thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you very much, East Brunswick Public Library. My name is Michael Gabriele. I'm an author with the History Press. History Press is based in South Carolina, and I've been working with them, I don't know, 15 years or so, maybe a little longer. I've published 5 books with them, all on New Jersey history, all local history. And the 5th and newest book, which just came out in April, is Colonial Taverns of New Jersey, which you can also see on the screen. That's book number 5, and very proud to be an author with the History Press. We can say right from the beginning, it's always good to give New Jersey a little pat on the back. I'm a Jersey guy, and let's just state for the record, New Jersey was the crossroads of the revolution. Let's be clear about that. It's not Williamsburg, Virginia, not even up in New England. This is where everything took place here in New Jersey. All the major battles, all the major encampments, all the major activities. George Washington spent most of his time here in New Jersey. His famous wintertime retreat in 1776 happened through New Jersey. So let's brag about New Jersey a little bit. We are the crossroads, the cockpit of the revolution, some people say. So this is where everything was happening. My books and my publisher were always interested in local history. So when I do a book, I sort of almost do it in a short story format. And I'm always trying to tell a story. These are not academic books. These are books I'm always interested in the human interest angle of the story. I'm trying to create a narrative. That's what I'm after. So that's when all my books are pretty much that same way and all about New Jersey. So Colonial Taverns were a very important part of the landscape back in the late 1600s and early 1700s, moving into the Revolutionary War years. They supported a lot of the war effort from the people, and I'll tell you a story in a little while about how they did that very directly. But taverns were an interesting place. I first stumbled upon them in an earlier book I had done. I learned that in my folk music book, taverns were the places where people would go to be entertained on nighttime. They'd sit around the fireplace and somebody would get up and sing a song from their homeland. They'd sing a traditional song from Wales or Scotland or Ireland, and everybody joined in. And I thought that was pretty interesting. This is how they had fun back in those days. And the tavern was really the hub of the community, the center of the town. So I made a footnote on that. And then when I went back and did some more research, I learned that, well, the tavern was really the focal point of the colonial village or even the region. It was a place where they conducted a lot of business, a lot of municipal governments. The local governments would meet at taverns, and that's where they would conduct their governmental business. A lot of financial issues were settled at taverns. Merchants came through. People were traveling from New York to Philadelphia. New Jersey's always been the corridor state. You have to go through New Jersey to get anywhere. So people, we used the old Native American trails, and there would be stage wagons or stage coaches going from New York to Philadelphia, there and back. It was about a 3-day trip on stagecoaches, on very rugged roads, I should say. The tavern was the place where people not only would meet, but they would discuss important issues like politics. A historian I came across said that taverns were the seedbeds of the revolution. And just to step back a little bit, people might assume that, well, the Revolutionary War was sort of a culmination of years and years of things that were building up, and sooner or later everybody wanted to declare their independence, and it was a long process. Not really, not really. In the 1700s, people in the colonies, or at least people here in New Jersey, were very happy to be part of the colony of England. This is where they came to make a new life in the new world, and they were established. They established business and families, and they were very happy to be part of the colony. That all changed by the end of the French and Indian War, which actually George Washington served as an officer. Once that war was over, the king of England started to impose a lot of regulations, a lot of rules, and a lot of taxes. People here in New Jersey didn't like that. They thought that was a very tyrannical way for them to try to have them rule their lives. Taxation without representation. See, that's the key phrase. They wouldn't have minded local taxes, but they didn't like the idea of some faraway king across the ocean just sort of arbitrarily imposing taxes. So things started to take a turn then in the 1760s. A lot of people started to complain that they tried to pass the Stamp Act. People didn't like that here, and the friction started to develop, and British soldiers were brought in, and there was ferment in the air. People knew something was happening. There's a lot of buzz, and a lot of that buzz happened inside the taverns. Tavern was a public venue, so anybody could come into the tavern and talk to their friends. They always did it at one end of the bar or the other. Interesting story. Well, you know what? Let's go to the slideshow. One thing I like about a story like Colonial Taverns, I always like to say that it's living history. Yes, this is something that happened 250 years ago, but the history is alive today. Things that people did back in those days, really, that's the foundation for our lives today. They established legislation and rules for government. They established the transportation network that we eventually had. They established businesses. They established the routes along the rivers. So we've built upon that foundation, and that's really the lives we have today. And you see that living history in places like Monmouth Battlefield. They have a reenactment, I think, every 2 years. And these are the British reenactors, and these are the colonial reenactors. And I love the reenactors. They're very serious about what they do, and they're very particular about having the proper dress and the right kind of buttons and the muskets that they have, the hats. It's all very authentic. They take great pride in that, and they think it's important, and it is important. And really, when they do an event like this, it's inspirational. You see what went on all those years ago, and they do this reenactment, and they're very passionate about it. So I give them a lot of credit. Where was the first tavern in New Jersey? Well, hard to say, but at least according to my research, and maybe there was something before this, but you notice the name in the bottom left corner, Henry Lyon. He was a Scotsman, and he came to Newark. Newark was founded in 1666. As you can see, he was one of the townsmen. He was one of the pioneers and founders of Newark. And in 1668, the Newark Town Council decided that they needed to have a tavern because that was important for business. It was important for travelers. In fact, most colonial villages and regions basically mandated that taverns were available for travelers and business people because they knew that was important. And so, according to the primary source minutes, and they still exist, believe it or not, they decided that Henry Lyon, as soon as possible, was going to start a tavern for the entertainment of travelers. And the tavern was pretty much, it was a hospitality business. The stagecoaches would come through, the local people would come there and meet and talk and eat. It'd be a place where you could have your horses come in, and they would be bridled up and brushed and saddled and rested. So Henry Lyon, as far as I can tell, was our very first tavern owner, and good for him. He was, and there were lots of information about him in other books too. He was an important guy. He became a politician. He was the town treasurer. So he's an important person in New Jersey history. But you ever heard of him? I mean, nobody's ever heard of him, right? So it's that's it. That, by the way, that's a cemetery in Newark. I always like to make my presentations local as much as possible whenever I can. So here in East Brunswick, we're right near New Brunswick, and this is John. What's his name? Oops. John Nielsen, and he was a colonel in the Continental Army, and eventually he served. He was very important in Trenton. He did a lot of work for the government in Trenton, but he wanted to maintain his home in New Brunswick. He didn't want to relocate to Trenton. He wanted to stay here because he was very concerned about the conduct of the war. And John Nielsen, as far as we know, was the first New Jersey person to read aloud the Declaration of Independence. So July 4, 1776, he read it on July the 9th, 1776. And of course, the place he did it was at a tavern, because he knew that's where there would be a big audience. In fact, the tavern where he did it was a place where all the grain merchants would come. And once a week, they would come there, and they would have all their goods, and they would decide what the price of the grain was going to be for that particular month. So John Nielsen, and this is a statue. It's in New Brunswick. I found it. And there he is, reading the Declaration of Independence. And another important guy in New Jersey. And a local hero. And one of the interesting things, again, the idea of living history, several years ago, they marked the anniversary of his reading of the Declaration of Independence. They had his descendants all came, and the Daughters of the American Revolution organized this little event when they unveiled the statue. I think that's pretty cool. It's pretty nice. In East Jersey Old Town, if you've ever been there, it's a nice place. They've done a great job of relocating a lot of vintage buildings that were in New Brunswick and were in danger of being destroyed, torn down. I'm sure a lot of them were, but they did save a number of them. And it's in Piscataway, not far from the football stadium at Rutgers. And at East Jersey Old Town, they have the remnants of the Indian Queen Tavern. And it's set up in a way that would look like what it looked like way back when. So I took some pictures, and this gives you an idea what was tavern like life back in those days. The old joke is, what did people have for breakfast in 1776? Well, they probably started with a glass of rum or a glass of beer because you couldn't drink the water. The water was very bad. But the fermentation process for rum and cider and beer and other liquor drinks would purify the water. So everybody was drinking back in those days. It was safe to drink, much better than the water that you found around town. So I like this. It's a nice picture. And again, this is the inside. This is what a tavern would have looked like. So you can kind of imagine what things were like back in those days. I mentioned a few minutes ago that the tavern was a place where people would come to socialize. Well, I wanted to see if I could illustrate that. And sure enough, I found a genre painter this is a Dutch painter. And I believe this was this is a public domain painting, so I grabbed it. And as you can see, people are inside the tavern, they're having a good time. Dancing was very important back in those days. If you wanted a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you had to know how to dance and do the line dances. That's how you met people. So dancing was very important. And as you can see, they're dancing. And in the lower left corner, there's a little girl with her doll, and the boy has a duck. And see the fiddle player. Fiddle was the main instrument, not guitar, fiddle. That was the main instrument back in those days. So again, this is what was tavern like back in those days? What did it look like? Well, this is a pretty true representation. I mentioned before about New Jersey being the corridor state. Well, here's a good example. This was a print that I found online, and I tracked it down. It was at the University of Utah, at their library. And I made arrangements. I said, well, could I buy this print? I'd like to use it in my book. And I love this. I love the illustration because it shows really what was it like back in those days. There's a tavern, and there's their insignia, their sign, and they're the people. They're off on their way to go who knows where. And again, it's a glimpse of life back in those days. Now, when you talk about important taverns in New Jersey, this one is pretty important. This is in Haddonfield. In fact, that whole western coastline of New Jersey along the Delaware River, that's very historic with colonial and Revolutionary history. Haddonfield, Bordentown. Those towns are just there, and the people there really take pride and really try to preserve the history. So this is the Indian King Tavern today, but in September of 1777, the New Jersey Assembly, they were on the run because the British were after them. 1777, the war was already on. It was dangerous days. So they kept changing their location. They were in Princeton for a while, then they moved elsewhere. They came down to Haddonfield, and they had their meetings at this tavern. And at the meeting in September of 1777, they passed a piece of legislation, and it said that from here on in, any sort of legal document or deed or financial transaction, New Jersey was supposed to be known as a state, not a colony. So now think about it. 1777, the war's on. This is the New Jersey Assembly telling King George, hey, we're on the side of revolution. We don't want to be a colony. We want to be a state. And it happened on the second floor. This is the original building, and that's where it happened. So that's I'd say that's pretty important development. This is an important tavern, although it's not there anymore. This is Arnold's Tavern. It was in Morristown, but when they did all the redevelopment work on the green back in the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of stuff got torn down. Well, this was a casualty. And this is where, when George Washington had his first encampment in the winter at Morristown, this is where he stayed. And great illustration. And so Morristown's very important in our state. There's the sign on the green. It's not there anymore, but the sign's there. And there's George Washington. And that's him on the green in Morristown. Now this is, I think, one of my favorite stories that came out of the book and shows how the taverns interacted with what was going on back in those days. So it's November 1776. George Washington was getting his butt kicked by the British, and he started his famous retreat through New Jersey, and British were after him, and he was making his way down. Every step of the way, he would commandeer a tavern. That would be his headquarters. He spent a couple of days in Newark and went on. By early December, he had made his way down to Trenton. He had made arrangements for boats to be there so the men could cross the river and get into Pennsylvania and escape the British. The British were right on their heels. And so they stayed at a tavern, of course, in Pennsylvania. And that's where he made his plans to the famous Battle of Trenton. Now, when I was doing this research, it comes across. George Washington was, I mean, he was a regular guy. And we tend to put our heroes up on pedestals, but he was like a real guy and smart guy. And I'm sure he knew that, well, this is it. We're going to go back across the river to New Jersey, and we're going to try to engage the Hessians in Trenton. If we lose, that's it. It's all over. The war's done. We've lost. So now he had to come back. He had all his horses and his cannons and all his equipment. They had to get it back across the river. How did they do that? Well, the ferrymen on the Delaware and the tavern owners came to their aid. They knew what was going on. They realized what was happening. They knew the stakes. And so without the tavern owners and without the ferrymen, he would have never made it, because Christmas night, there was a snowstorm. There was ice on the river. The river at that point was only about 10 or 12 feet deep, but deep enough to drown people and sink all your equipment. So they helped them come back across the river with their cannons, with their horses, with their equipment. And without the tavern owners and the ferrymen, they would have never made it. So, and I like this as a dramatic picture of George Washington. I can picture him up on the horse saying, well, I hope this works, because if it doesn't, we're in big trouble. And they would have been in big trouble. And in Washington Crossing State Park, along the Delaware River, there's one building that still stands, still exists. It's a tavern. It used to be they call it the Johnson Tavern. And according to oral history, after they got across the river and it was snowing, George Washington and his generals, they went to this tavern and they made their final arrangements, final plans. How are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? It's going to be a surprise attack. So they went south to Trenton and they surprised the Hessians and they won. And they won. And then they went from there, they went on, they traveled north up to Princeton, the famous Battle of Princeton. They won there too. So now, all of a sudden, George is on a roll. And the Colonial Congress back in those days, like they're waiting for George to start winning some battles here. It's like, come on, George, things aren't looking too good. Now all of a sudden things are looking a little different. And then from the Battle of Princeton, they made their way up and eventually went to Morristown to encamp. So this structure is still standing in Washington Crossing State Park, and it was a tavern. So again, the important role of taverns back in those days. And there's a plaque that the Daughters of the American Revolution, boy, they know their stuff. They're very good. And there's a historic plaque that, near this spot, George Washington and his army crossed the Delaware River on the night of December 25th. So that's all you have to hear. Thomas Paine was on that famous retreat through New Jersey. He was marching with the soldiers and he was taking notes along the way. And this is where when they stopped in Newark for a couple of days, this is where he pretty much wrote all of his famous essay, The Crisis, which was read to the troops before they came back over to New Jersey for the famous battle. Now, The Crisis is probably one of the most important essays that was written back in that time. I knew a little bit about Thomas Paine, not much, and I really didn't. I knew The Crisis, but I never had read the thing. If you read it, he's talking about New Jersey. It's all these references to New Jersey. He made a reference to a tavern in Perth Amboy, and he's talking about the troops coming down. They're in Newark. He's talking about, if only a heavenly Jersey maid would come down and help our cause. He's writing about New Jersey. So this is one of the famous documents of the Revolutionary War. New Jersey is the crossroads of the Revolution. And so now Thomas Paine, he was like the most famous intellectual in the world back in those days. All the ideas that came out of the Declaration of Independence and even our Constitution, these were ideas that were first originated with Thomas Paine: separation of church and state, right to vote. He had all these ideas, and he had a favorite tavern in Bordentown. Washington House, which is an old photograph that I got from the Bordentown Historical Society, and that's it on the right. And this is where Thomas Paine would hold court, and he would this is after the war, he would get into these long philosophical debates with people and have long discussions, and he had his favorite drink, and he would walk around town, so he was quite well known in Bordentown. When the war came to a close, 1783, and they started talking about the Treaty of Paris, which formally ended the war, and that's how we got to become independent from the British. So George Washington and his best generals, they all met at Fraunce's Tavern in Lower Manhattan. And this is a plaque that documents that on the side of the tavern. December 4, 1783. And we know this happened because, again, a lot of these primary source documents still exist. There was a newspaper in New York, and it was actually, it was really a patriot. I mean, it was a loyalist newspaper, loyal to the king. And they wrote a news story about George Washington meeting his generals at Fraunce's Tavern. They covered it, and the date and everything. So so now there he is. And Fraunce's Tavern still exists. It's a really nice place. My wife and I were there not too long ago. It's a nice bar. They have good music. They have very nice food, and it's a very historic site. The part of the story that I like is that they met on the afternoon of December 4, and they were having all these long toasts and speeches, and they were clinking their glasses and drinking wine. And at the end of all that, George Washington and his entourage, they left the tavern, they went over to the river, and they crossed over into Jersey City. And that was his point where he started his journey down to Annapolis, where he was going to give up his commission. He was going to hand in his sword and say, well, we won the war, I was a general, I'm out of here. But little did he know that they were going to call him back when they started to debate the Constitution. And then, of course, he became the first president. So I think that's the last. Oh, there's Fraunce's Tavern. So what else is there to say about taverns back in those days? Well, like I said, they were very friendly to the Continental Army troops, especially when times were bad. I mean, you read the accounts. I mean, I don't know how George Washington did it. These guys were half starved. They were wearing rags until they got uniforms, courtesy of the French. They were like, their shoes were like practically nothing. They were marching around in the heat of summer and the dead cold of winter. How he held things together, it's really amazing. I don't know if George Washington has ever gotten really the credit due for how he pulled this off. It's a miracle when you think about all the things he was up against, the biggest army in the world. And here he had the Continental Army in rags, but somehow he did it. So when the war broke out, taverns became very important because they were the stations where you could enlist in the local militias. The militias were separate from the Continental Army, but they would join ranks when the time came. So they were headquarters for militias. They were headquarters for the committees of safety. The committees of safety were like the local regional governments, and they decided upon everything that was going on in the village or the various towns back in those days. And all the meetings took place at taverns. The Sons of the Revolution, they first met up in Boston, but they came down here to New Jersey to enlist people to join. They did it at the taverns. Because the tavern was a legal scholar explains to me, the tavern, it was important that it was a public venue because you could meet whenever you wanted to there. And the British soldiers and the British spies, they knew something was going on. They knew they were onto something. So now, if there was going to be a meeting held in secret, way out in the woods in some cabin, and they were going to be talking about revolution and things like that, if the British found out about that, they went out there, they would say, we caught these guys now. They were meeting in secret. We got them. We're going to arrest them. But now, if they had these discussions in the tavern, well, it's a public venue. And so the loyalists met at taverns, so did the patriots. And this legal scholar wrote an essay, and I called him, I found out who he was, I got his contact information, I called him up. He said that idea of meeting at a tavern in a public venue, that's really the basis for our assembly clause in the Constitution. So people could meet and talk about whatever they wanted. They had to be a little careful, but the British were watching, but they couldn't do anything because it was a public venue. So that's another reason why taverns were important. When merchants would come back and forth between New Brunswick, New York, Newark, Perth Amboy, Princeton, the merchants would come and they crossed the river in Delaware, they crossed the river in New York, the Hudson River, and they would bring all their goods, their hay, their wheat, their barley. They would have all their animals that they would bring. And along the way, they would stop at the taverns. And the taverns were the places, and the taverns were the places they made a lot of business deals back in those days. So taverns were really much more than just a place to drink and eat and socialize. It was that, but it was more than that. And I thought that as I started doing this research, and it became clear to me that the tavern was really a window into that era of New Jersey history. And it's grassroots, real people, real life history. What were people doing back in those days? And what were the challenges that they were facing? How were they conducting their business? What was family life like back in those days? So the tavern was a stage where all that drama took place. And so I thought that was a pretty good way to really, again, the idea my publisher likes local history. Well, this is local history. And again, what went on in the taverns and in the villages, we owe these people a big debt because they really established the way of life here in New Jersey for hundreds and hundreds of years to come. We are their descendants. We've inherited that legacy, and so very important. So I thought it was a good idea for a book. And, I don't know. My publisher liked it. I've got a very good relationship with the History Press. I've known them now for many years. I have people, my marketing person, my sales representative, my acquisition editor. We're friends, but it's a business relationship, and that's really the way it should be. So they're very receptive. I mean, I've written 5 books for them, and they're very receptive. If I've got an idea for a book, I pitch it. But I mean, I've got to explain myself. I have to say, well, this is my idea for a book. Oh, that's interesting. And what are you going to write about? And I have to tell them. And then, well, who's the audience? I have to tell them that too. And so far, they've never said no. So I don't take this lightly. I do not have a cavalier attitude about it. I'm in a position as an author that not many people have. I'm aware of that, and I've got a very good relationship with my publisher. And and so now I was a newspaper guy for many, many years, and I wrote for magazines. Never thinking I would be a book author, and then one day I became a book author. Sat down in front of the computer, interviewed some people, gathered some images, started typing. 3 years or so, you got a book. So it's kind of how it goes. So I hope everybody out there in internet land is having fun. Do we have?
Yeah, it's 26 people.
All right, from all over the world. Maybe.
No one's really written in the chat. They're kind of quiet, but no, we do. We do have a question.
Okay, first question online.
Where were the Colonial Taverns in Middlesex County located? So I'm guessing probably places like Kingston, or did you find any
Yes.
local in the book?
Kingston was a very important place for the taverns because you always have to think logistics. Think about the meeting places and how the stage wagons would run. They needed a spot. If they were coming from New York, they'd have to stay like halfway. So Kingston, there was a very famous tavern back in those days, and I write about it in the book. There were taverns in Monmouth County. New Brunswick is Middlesex County? So
Yes.
yeah, there's a lot. There were many taverns in New Brunswick, and one in particular I read about. Women were a lot of taverns were run and owned by women. And there was a tavern in New Brunswick, and the primary source documents exist, and they came to this tavern in New Brunswick, and the town council of New Brunswick met there, and they decided upon things like, well, how we're going to put cobblestones in the street and things like that, and they defined it where they were. So yeah, so there were a lot of middle of New Jersey is a big place for taverns, and again, Western New Jersey, that's so much of our history back in those days. So, any questions here in the audience? Any audience? Do you? I tell people, did you ever find the name of that place that you're looking for?
Yes, I'm sorry.
I
will go there and
All
find
right.
it for you. I'll write it.
I'll give you my business card.
Okay.
When you do a book like this, the research doesn't stop. The book comes out, and now people are emailing me, or people meet me at these presentations I do. And they, oh, do you know about this tavern? Well, I say, no, I really don't. Can you tell me a little bit about it? And I'll write it. Now I started a new file. Taverns that I didn't know about. And there's a lot of them. I mean, I try. These are not academic books. This is not an academic book for high school students or college students. I mean, I hope they read it, but I'm telling stories. I'm trying to develop a narrative. One of my editors once told me that, well, one of the big differences between writing a newspaper article, 500 words, and a book, 50,000 words, you've got to establish your narrative. You have to have a voice, right from the introduction all the way to the very end. And you have to tell stories. And that's what I'm interested in doing. I'm very particular about names and dates and places. I try to be very accurate about that. But I'm telling human interest stories. How did people, what were their lives like back those days? It's, I find it fascinating. These are our ancestors. These are people, I don't know if maybe they didn't realize what they were doing back in those days. I don't know how long, maybe they didn't think this would last that long, but 250 years later, here we are. And we're going to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2826. Yeah, so, well, New Jersey had a big part in that. So I hope people in Trenton, hello Trenton, let's make sure we promote that and that people know about this. It's very important. New Jersey's, I'll say it again, we're the corridor state, we're the crossroads of the revolution. People should know about that. I mean, there's a lot of people who make jokes about New Jersey, and who cares? But we've got a vibrant history here, because we're back in the start in the 1600s. So, any other questions from the audience? Yeah, no. An online question?
Nothing yet. I asked them to place 4 in the chat.
All right, come on, people, help me out here. Ask me something. If I don't know the answer, I'll make it up. So, who knows, right? So, I do have books here for sale. And
Did they make their own liquor?
yes, they did. The first brewer of beer was a guy in Hoboken. And as far as you can only go back so far, and then the written record gets a little fuzzy. But there was a man in Hoboken. He was probably our first beer brewer. But beer was probably, in those early days, was probably the number 3 drink. The most popular drink in taverns in those early years was rum. People loved rum. And that came from the West Indies. The molasses from the sugar plantations would come up. They'd deliver it to Perth Amboy, and then they started processing it and fermenting it, and then they had rum. The Patriots here in the colonies, they got wind of this and said, well, we don't need to buy our rum from Britain. We can make our own rum. So they started having their own side deals and got molasses and started brewing their own rum. So that was really the most popular drink at a tavern. And again, it was because it was fermented, safe to drink, no problem. Everybody drank alcoholic beverages back in those days, all day and all night. The second most popular drink at a tavern would have been hard apple cider. Yeah, very popular. And the best apple orchards were in Newark. And they had all these varieties of apples that were the best for making cider. It's funny, some of these apple varieties are extinct. They lost them. They don't know where they are anymore. But every once in a while, somebody's strolling around the woods, and they come upon it and say, "Hey, nobody's seen this brand of apple for 200 years." So apple cider, and then beer, and then there were other liquors that they would have. The Swedes were very much known for being good brewmasters. So yeah, they made their own beer, and they distributed it, and then wine started to become very popular. Way out in western New Jersey, there was a man in Bordentown, and he wrote this essay about this would be a great place to have wine vineyards because it's the climate is better than France and England, and this is a place we could make our own wine, and we could export it, and we'd make a lot of money. And so people were very business savvy back in those days. It's all about business.
Laird's Blended Applejack.
Yes.
There in Colts Neck, it is one of the colonial apple brandies.
That's right.
We have to put it in mince pie in my household. That is the tradition. If it doesn't have Laird's in it, they know.
Yes.
But they still can get it. They're based out of.
That's right. It's
It's tasty stuff.
That's right. Jersey Lightning was their big seller back in the colonial days. And again, a little Jersey pride. They are the oldest distillery that's on record in the United States. So yeah.
It's in Colts
Yeah.
1698.
Yeah.
In the ledger since 1780.
Yeah. And they ran a tavern for a while, and the Mr. Laird, I think, was a Scotsman, and he came, he was suffering religious persecution in Scotland. He came over here and he started a business. This was the new world. People liked, if they were adventurous enough, they would come here and they'd start a brand new life and have their own business, and you could become very wealthy. Yes, slavery was part of what was going on back in those days. It was part of the business, and most people probably didn't even think anything twice about it. They said, "Oh, of course we have slaves on the farm, But there were a lot of people who were abolitionists. They said, "No, this is wrong. Slavery is evil. It should not be part of our lives." And there was a famous Quaker preacher by the name of John Woolman. He was from down in Mount Holly. And when he was a young man, he got the reputation of being a grand orator. And his Quaker colleagues encouraged him. He had all these wonderful ideas. He was against slavery. This is wrong. We should not be doing this. "Oh, go, John." So they said, "Listen, you have a gift for being able to give speeches. You should go around all the places in New Jersey." And he actually did. He persuaded a lot of merchants and a lot of farmers that no, you shouldn't have slaves. And of course, where did he go to deliver his sermons? Taverns, because he knew he'd have a big audience there. And the tavern keeper would be very happy to have him because, oh, John Woolman's in town. Well, they're going to get a big audience, and a lot of people are going to be in the tavern, and they're going to want something to drink. So it was a nice relationship. So yeah, yes.
Were there other immigrants that contributed a lot to colonial taverns?
You hear about different people. There was in the Colts Neck area, there was a big Jewish community there. They had taverns. Irish and Scotch people, British people, the Germans, the Swedes had a lot of. They were known as very good producers of beer and liquor. Yeah, it was. I mean, New Jersey. We've always been diverse. We've always been the corridor state. People pass through here and they say, "Hey, it's kind of like it around here." They say what you want. A lot of people want to live in New Jersey. We've got the mountains, we got the seashore, the shore. So that's that's how it went way back when. And they all had a good time, mostly. So, are there any other online questions?
There are no other
Well, if that's the case, then I we're right on time here. We can chit chat a little bit. I have my books. If you want to come up and buy them, and be very happy to autograph them for you. So
Well, thank you so much to everyone who joined us online. We wish you could have been here, but thank you for joining, and have a good evening, everyone.
I'll see you around. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Appreciate it.
Is your thing working?